This week, disinformation is plaguing the Western world and the African continent as China and Russia are vying to expand their influence. It lives on social media platforms and influences the way people think and act. We often see fictitious information presented as trustworthy news. Is the West and Africa in the same boat? How can we, the citizens, distinguish truth from fiction? Straight Talk Africa starts now. Welcome to Straight Talk Africa. I'm Vincent McCory, Managing Editor of English to Africa Television. Haiti will be with you next week. Now, disinformation is the buzzword these days all over the world, and social media platforms are the vehicle. In Africa, the last 7 years, social media users tripled from 100 million to over 400 million people, and the use of artificial intelligence creates a fertile ground for the spreading of misleading information fast and in different countries simultaneously, especially when it focuses on controversial subjects such as politics and healthcare. Disinformation spreads fast, but journalists in Africa are fighting back by creating an extensive network of fact-checkers who set the record straight. Victoria Munga has our report from Nairobi, Kenya.
A decade-long career in Kenyan media has attuned journalist Alphonse Shiundu to some of the gaps in news coverage, among them awareness of disinformation. When Shiundu first became fascinated by the spread of false information, it was an issue mostly downplayed inside newsrooms, he says.
The fact-checking wasn't quite there. So they're interested in putting out as many stories as they can put out. They're interested in having stories that can sell. And this is being produced without sufficient number of people checking to find out that the public is being informed correctly.
Sure. What's this story?
It's a challenge that Shiundu is tackling head-on as the Kenya editor at Africa Check, a non-profit seeking to promote accuracy and media literacy on the continent. Shiundu and his team say large numbers of people fall prey to inaccurate or incomplete information, and sometimes it comes from official-sounding sources.
A more recent example is where somebody claims that unemployment in Kenya has averaged 5% across 5 years, across the last 2 decades or something like that. So we have to check exactly when he says unemployment, what does that mean? How is it defined? Who has the data?
The internet and social media have enabled disinformation and misinformation to spread further and faster. And with the swift rise in artificial intelligence technology, Shiundu says they're in a race against time to cut off disinformation before it reaches the public. Already, many fall victim to false information on topics such as job vacancies, public figures, and vaccination campaigns policies, he says. Such news can confuse and upset people.
The fake news I got was about opposition leader Raila Odinga meeting with President William Ruto to talk about working together, what is popularly known as a handshake. I was hurt.
Africa Check researcher Tess Wandia says that women and marginalized communities are often vulnerable.
When it comes to disinformation and accessing credible information, people who are having a challenge existing in society have a more sheltered existence, right? So they may be unaware of where to find credible information.
Disinformation is also used to attack or harass public figures. A 2021 study by the US-based organization Women in International Security found that nearly 42% of female politicians have been harassed online with humiliating or sexualized images and comments.
Usually we'll see that there's an aspect of sexualization around the disinformation that is being spread about women. And this is not usually very common with men.
Kenya has enacted a cybercrime law to counter disinformation. But Victor Capillo, a digital rights expert affiliated with the think tank Kiktanet, says it's problematic to apply because of the law's obscurity in defining fake news.
It's difficult to enforce from a legal perspective because we don't have the capacity, and we've not invested in such capacity to investigate and prosecute people who are spreading disinformation.
Media freedom advocates worldwide warn that such laws can also be open to abuse, with some officials using them to silence critical, factual reporting. But at least when it comes to disinformation, the team at Africa Check are there to set the record straight. Victoria Amunga for VOA News, Nairobi.
Well, thank you, Victoria, for this report. Now, with me to discuss the challenges of disinformation is Jessica Jarrett, Voice of America Press Freedom Editor. Also with us via Skype is Paul Nantulia, Research Associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Straight Talk Africa, Jessica and Paul. Now, let's start with something that stumps many people, in fact. It is the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Paul, if I may begin with you, let's help our viewers distinguish the two.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Vincent. Great to be on the show. And hi to Jessica on the other side. Well, with disinformation is basically outright fake news, essentially lies, things that are untrue, but which are presented as the truth. This is what disinformation might be defined as. Misinformation is a little more sophisticated because you're going to have an element of truth. Misinformation always has an element of truth in it, but then you try to look for very, very sophisticated ways of bending that truth and presenting a false narrative to target audiences. So it's much more difficult to identify than disinformation.
Yeah, and so it's a bit more creative. Now, Jessica, a 2022 NPR report, that is a National Public Radio Survey, and there was another one by Quinnipiac University, found that an explosion of misinformation here in the United States is eroding public the public confidence, or public's confidence in America's democracy. So the question is, does this necessarily come from social media, this misinformation, or are the mainstream media also becoming both culprits and victims of misinformation?
That's a good question, Vincent, and thank you so much for talking about disinformation today, because I think the issues of media trust and the way that disinformation has become so pervasive in our society, even here in the US, is something that we're seeing more and more. Disinformation, it's existed much longer before it became like a buzzword. For as soon as we had like printing presses, there were people who found ways to manipulate public opinion. But what we've seen is a ramping up now with the internet and social media that can make disinformation and misinformation spread so much faster. A lot of studies, like the one that you mentioned particularly, and a study in 2018 by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, found what I find most worrying, which is a lie spreads 6 times faster than the truth. So if you have credible media, which is usually the antidote to disinformation and misinformation, our voices are being drowned out. If you add to that sort of polarization in the US and in the West and in Africa, and some of the other issues around elections, and the fact that particularly the media industry is going through a lot of economic issues at the moment, we have less access to credible news and to journalists who act as that public watchdog and the sort of guardians of truth. And people on our phones, we're like inundated with misinformation and disinformation.
And we'll dissect that further. I just want to go to Paul. People used to associate misinformation and disinformation with the individuals and certain groups, that have some weird agendas. But our fingers are pointing at actually state actors, even big, powers in the world. So how is this playing out, especially in Africa, Paul?
Well, it's playing out in very interesting ways. I mean, I will focus on China because, that's what I study. And I recently put out a report last week that was looking at the Chinese United Front operations in Africa. And this media operations, as well as initiatives that are aimed at propagating certain narratives about, 60, 70% of the truth, but then the other 30% is a very creative way of sending a message, has become very, very prevalent. And This is very attractive philosophically and ideologically to China, because China has always been very, very accustomed to the idea of fighting without, fighting non-physically, right? Fighting without weapons, right?
Yeah.
The idea of the war of words and the battle of ideas. It's very attractive because you can basically send narratives and messages with plausible deniability, and you're able to do it. You're able to sow division among adversaries and among target audiences. So it's very, very attractive, and it's also cost effective.
Yeah, and Paul, when you talk about, say, that kind of a misinformation that is perpetrated by a country across the continent of Africa, we have the implications that it has on the countries, on the continent as a whole. But also, we know that there is also usually, this is supposed to counter some of the, say, Western influence of the continent of Africa. But what are the long-term implications for the people of Africa when we know that this is where the continent is at the moment?
Well, first is you now have an environment where truth is distorted, right? There's a distortion of the truth. There's a distortion of facts. And that becomes extremely difficult. And when you're looking at, for instance, in academic settings, you're beginning to talk about issues of academic freedom and freedom of thought, right? So that is the first impact. The second impact is, Africa is a continent that is growing in the use of social media. I mean, I was in Tanzania, you walk around, fishermen, ordinary people, everybody has got a smartphone, you understand? So it becomes very, very difficult, right, to sift through all the information overload that you have, right, on the African continent. So it becomes very, very difficult. And when you have established biases, things that basically confirm your biases, it becomes extremely difficult. So this is a very unique challenge that African countries are to face. Because again, we talked about plausible deniability. It's very difficult to pin these things on the Chinese government per se.
Yeah, and we'll look at further down on some of the areas where it is really impacting people's day-to-day activities. Jessica, you talked about a lie sometimes is believed easier and faster than the truth, but research has also established that misinformation that is generated by AI is actually even more believable than misinformation that is written by a human. So the question becomes, can we fight successfully against against AI misinformation, or should we embrace AI and use it to fight against misinformation?
Well, I think the AI element has really changed the landscape of what we're up against with disinformation. AI learns from the internet and what we put out there, and some of the major news outlets have actually put restrictions on the way that some of these artificial intelligence can draw facts from credible verified news, which leaves a lot of people asking, well, where is this AI going to learn the information from? We've already started to see China and Russia use deep fakes, incredibly realistic people who look like news hosts or news web pages that replicate what looks like a verified news outlet, and it's becoming incredibly hard to know how to combat that and with regulations. But we do have a lot of good fact-checking organizations that are very attuned into this and are looking at some of how AI learns and what are the markers that people go off of when they choose to share or to spread that sort of mis and disinformation, and how to cancel that, because often it's sparked by a negative reaction that helps expedite it. People or AI and the hostile actors who use it tend to push in on our divisions and the polarization, and then that sort of just builds on social media. So it's just sort of way to find a way to sort of roll that back in and combat it. But and
Paul, I did cover the 2022 Kenyan elections. I was in Kenya, and in the run-up to that election, and actually even after the election, there was a lot of fake polls, fake videos, a lot of stuff that was obviously misinformation on Twitter, on social media. Now, the question becomes really to what extent, in fact, is misinformation influencing elections, for example, not only in Africa, but even in the United States and elsewhere? And how dangerous is this moving forward? And who is interested in manipulating elections?
Well, Vincent, lots of people are interested in manipulating elections, both domestically and internationally. You rightly say that in the Kenyan case there was a lot of it going around. But the impact of it is quite clear. When you're able to sway particular constituencies in one particular direction, you're able to sway politicians and even very senior people in another direction. It becomes very attractive for those who want to use these sorts of means, especially through social media and these deep fakes that Jessica was talking about. I mean, I have been traveling for the last 2 days back to the United States from Tanzania, and I'm telling you, Vincent, when I landed, I had a bombardment of WhatsApp messages from different people, different highly placed individuals, right, policymakers and so on, who are asking about this story, which has turned out to be fake. That apparently, the fires that were raging in Maui in Hawaii were caused by a weather weapon that had been manufactured by the United States military. And researchers have shown that some Chinese social media users and influencers were actually spreading this story. But these were very senior people that were asking as to the veracity of these particular stories. Now that becomes extremely critical because these stories can have a strategic effect and can actually influence the thinking of very senior people.
And that's really
a clear impact.
Really dangerous. Just very quickly, in terms of fact checking now, how is this succeeding? Including with us here at the Voice of America.
Yeah, well, particularly at Voice of America, we know that credible journalism makes a huge difference in countering a lot of this disinformation, and we do have our own fact-checking unit, Polygraph, which goes through and tries to debunk some of the worst disinformation, like the Hawaii case that Paul just mentioned. And there's other groups. There's the International Fact-Checking Coalition, and there's also a lot of programs looking at media literacy, which tries to help readers and audiences understand how to verify and check and think before we spread. So I think there are things that are being done. And there's also some really good studies between the Reuters Institute, which has a Trust in Journalism project, which looks at where there's weaknesses, and some of the other the EU, for instance, has looked a lot at how China and Russia are trying to use tactics to dismay and distract from people questioning from questioning them about their human rights abuses or the war in Ukraine. So there are organizations and high-profile researchers who are really focused on finishing this. Figuring this out.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks to both of you, Jessica and Paul, for your insights. We have to leave it right there. Coming up after the break, we'll delve into the reasons for Russian propaganda in Africa. According to our next guest, Russia has made a tremendous successful advancements in this story, in the history of propaganda. So don't go away. We'll be right back after the break.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in
first Africa Climate Summit held in Kenya has concluded with the Nairobi Declaration, calling for world leaders to ensure large-scale financing for climate-related investments and debt relief. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we will look at African women's role in protecting their environment and ask experts for ways their voices are represented in the global fight against climate change. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
Well, since 2020, we've seen 7 coups in Central and West Africa, and at the same time, in the same region, the influence of Russia and the Wagner military group is prevalent. My colleague Ignatius Anor spoke with Dan Whitman, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a former United States Foreign Service officer who spent a significant amount of time working in a number of African countries.
Russia has made tremendous propaganda successes and disinformation campaigns. We can get into the details of it, but in short, and I would say 2 or 3 years, they have made the most rapid propaganda successes, I would say, in the history of propaganda. And it's no secret how they do it, and it's no secret why they do it. Instability is a Garden of Eden for disinformation. Russia does not cause instability. Russia notices when there is instability, and they go in and they take advantage of it. No differently from any other large power that would tend to do the same sort of thing. The difference is Russia is much more systematic, much more consequential, much more strategic in the way they do this. They do not create disorder and the disruption of civic harmony. They don't create these things, but they notice when they happen, and this becomes a fertile ground for their malicious actions.
Now, talking about fertile grounds, which countries on the continent of Africa have you identified to be, the breeding ground for the propagation of disinformation? And as well, you want to talk to us about why they are becoming the targets by the Russians?
Let me go to that second question first. Why does Russia want to destabilize Africa? For what purpose? I want to remind your listeners, your observers, between Russia and Africa, less than 1% of commercial exchange comes from Russia. So Russia has nothing to offer in terms of material wealth, in terms of infrastructure, or really anything else. What Russia is seeking, I think it's quite apparent. The disorder that they see, the potential for disorder that they see, especially in the Sahel, but also in parts of Central Africa and Mozambique, by the way, is one of the purposes behind them. There are many Russian jokes about people when they're in a bad situation. They don't seek to improve their own situation. They seek only to make the neighbor's situation even worse than their own.
But the Russians will tell you that they see Africa as a partner. Is the reason they've been holding this Africa-Russia summit, which, the last one was held, as a commitment to show, the kind of partnership they want to have with the continent.
Yes, and how many people showed up to that summit? Far fewer than those who showed up at the previous one. At previous summits that Russia has held, they've offered one thing to the heads of state, which is weapons. Let me get back to why I believe Russia is doing this, and I believe this is part of another strategy. I believe that Russia right now is trying to look at Africa, which has 54 votes in the General Assembly of the United Nations, to try to peel them off little by little from support for the Ukraine side in the current conflict. And with each succeeding vote, we see fewer African countries voting to condemn Russian actions. Why is this? Coercion, bribery, and a readjustment of Africans' sense of their own self-interest.
Right, Dan. To that very point, if you speak to Africans today, here's what they will tell you. They will tell you about their need for something tangible. And when I say tangible, I'm talking infrastructure development, I'm talking money, I'm talking even food, as we've seen from the war that's happening in Ukraine now. Does it come to you that the neglect of most parts of the world against the African people may have perhaps opened the floodgate for what you put to be the gains that the country's making with disinformation?
Absolutely, no dispute with what you're saying, Ignatius. What puzzles me is how could Africans or their governments believe that Russia could do something for them? Russia, at this time, the increase in the price of food, especially in the Horn, we know who's causing that. It's Russia. We know that instability, Russia does not create it, but it profits by it. I don't doubt the sincerity of the people in the streets in Niamey, in Conakry, in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, with their anti-French signs. I don't doubt their sincerity. What puzzles me is, what would make them think that with the neglect, and I admit, neglect on the part of the Western powers, what would make them think that Russia has something for them? There's no infrastructure, there's no commercial exchange, there's no exchange of gray matter. I am puzzled. There may be an explanation for this. I understand, we saw at the BRICS conference recently, Africa is looking for alternatives to the traditional bipolar, that's gone, the bipolar thing. We have India, we have Turkey, we have China, obviously. There are a lot of things going on, and I respect Africans' perception that they need a new formulation for their own self-interest. What I don't understand is how they would imagine that Russia could provide anything that they need.
Would you agree that Africans at this particular time have a legitimate reason to look for alternatives?
Absolutely, and they have wonderful alternatives. They have Turkey, they have India, they have the private sector, by the way, the big multinational corporations, which have a bad name, and they're associated with exploitation and with disregard for environmental conditions. Actually, some of the private corporations may have more to offer than any nation state might have. Private corporations, some of them, not all of them, have understood that only by having a rule of law and a society that's functional will their investments will there be return on their investments. Therefore, private companies, especially the large ones, seem to be, in some cases, more effective at building civil society in Africa than governments are, or so-called aid organizations. I grant you, Ignatius, there's a lot. This is a very complicated formula. It's no longer the Cold War. That's over. It's no longer two sides. It's many different agents seeing what they can get. What I hope, because I care about Africa, is that Africa will make options that will have mutual benefit, both for Africa and for their partners. I'm afraid that too often the partners get the bulk of the benefits.
Well, and that's our show for today. Don't forget to send us a comment on X, formerly known as Twitter, and let us know what you think about the show, or go to Facebook and leave a comment. Thank you for joining us. See you next week.